From the Blavatnik Harvard Life Lab, this is the Pulse Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Tanner Baldwin.
And I'm your other host, Fang Xie. Together, we dive deep into the most interesting biotech stories and feature world-class biotech leaders. This podcast is brought to you by the Harvard Griffin Jesus Biotech Club.
Today's guest is Dr. Mark Namchuk. Mark is the inaugural Pooja and Samir Kaul Professor of the Practice of Biomedical Innovation and Translation at Harvard and the Executive Director of Therapeutics Translation at Harvard Medical School. Before he joined Harvard, Mark had a 24-year research and development career in the biotech industry, working in a number of areas, including drug discovery, translational science, and pharmaceutical development. Mark began his industry career at Cubist Pharmaceuticals as head of the enzymology group. Then Mark spent 17 years at Vertex, holding a number of senior research positions, including Senior Vice President of North American Research and Interim Global Head of Research. In 2015, Mark joined Alkermes as Senior Vice President. Over more than 2 decades, he has directed drug discovery efforts in numerous therapeutic areas, including infectious disease, oncology, neurodegenerative psychiatric disorders, inflammatory disease, and orphan diseases. Mark received his PhD in bioorganic chemistry at the University of British Columbia and was a Human Frontier Science Program postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, San Francisco. We're very lucky to have Dr. Namchuk here with us at the Life Lab. Mark, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure to be with you both.
Mark, I was hoping you could start by just telling us a little bit about your early life and your upbringing, and specifically what sparked your interest in science.
Yeah. So I grew up in Western Canada, in Edmonton, and lived there until I went to graduate school in Vancouver. In terms of growing up, I was the first kid in my extended family to go to university. Mm-hmm. But my father in particular loved science. So every Sunday we'd be watching Nova, or we'd be watching any of these different science programs, and I'd want to turn a cartoon on, and Dad's like, no, you got to watch this stuff. And I guess it put a bit of a hook in me. Uh-huh. And as time went on, I really gravitated towards just loving the scientific art, how you can unravel a problem, the discipline that went with it, and also feeling like it's something that you can work on, and it felt substantial. Mm-hmm. You know, to this day, I think there's this moment where, both of you are researchers. You see something at the bench, and no matter how small it is, for that 1 second, you're the only person in the world that knows that thing. We can get so tied up in all the big parts of science, but that little part, I think that's what really always interested me. So I think a lot of it was just family, and probably the other inspiration is I loved the original Star Trek, and I wanted to be Mr. Spock. Mm-hmm. Spock was so much cooler than Kirk, stronger, smarter. So I figured, okay, I should try and see what I can do to be a little bit more like Leonard Nimoy.
Yeah, I think every scientist sees a little bit of Spock in himself. You capture sort of one of the most beautiful elements of research very well. So thank you for that. After you completed your PhD in Canada, you did a postdoc at UCSF. And then you made a transition to industry. Can you tell us a little bit about the choice to complete a postdoc and then ultimately the transition to industry?
Sure. I think, I'm relatively old, so this is going back 30 years. In those days, doing a postdoc was pretty standard. Uh-huh. So a lot more it wasn't so much of a choice if you wanted to have a path to getting either a good position in industry or potentially an academic position. Mm-hmm. You pretty much had to do a postdoctoral fellowship. At that point in my life, I was pretty convinced I was going to go to academia. And in particular, I wanted to move back to Canada. And it was just a really difficult time to get back into academic science. Mm-hmm. And so I was in the 3rd year of my postdoc and got a random phone call from a recruiter who had been referenced to me by my lab mate when I was at University of British Columbia, who had just taken a job at Pfizer. And said, if you wanted somebody that's going to work in enzymology and things, why don't you speak with Mark? And that's how I ended up getting interviewed for the job at Cubist.
Amazing. So your first job is head of enzymology at Cubist. And I think this is a bit unusual for a fresh postdoc directly appointed to the leadership role. So tell us the backstory.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's a smaller company, so we'll put leadership role in some bunny ear quotes. I was running a pretty small group. But I think it's part of where I had experience from being a postdoctoral fellow. So I wasn't coming in fresh out of my PhD. I was a little older. I'd had a chance to do some more science and show that I could do independent work in different fields. And I think that helped, giving the company some confidence in putting me in charge of a small group. I'd also had a chance to supervise a couple of people while I was a postdoc. So I had a little bit of supervisory experience coming into it. So I think the transition, it's kind of it's a funny story. It's an unusual one these days, but I was asked to interview. So I was living in San Francisco at the time and flew to Boston in the middle of a snowstorm. I come flying in the middle of a snowstorm. Growing up in Edmonton, the weather didn't bother me very much. Came out, interviewed for the first day. They said, we'll pay for your hotel, stay a second day. We want you to meet the scientific founders. Met them, came back. They gave me an offer letter to take on the plane to go home.
Wow.
So it's I think, one of these big transitions where you're working as a postdoc, you're kind of, the living isn't the most glamorous at that point. And I come home and I'm looking at a salary that at the time was something I'd never even dreamed existed.
Wow.
Just even as a starting job, my again, grew up relatively modest upbringing, good middle class, hardworking folks, and looking at that, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. So I come home and I sit down with my wife and I go, I think we got to have to do this. This would be pretty cool. So that was the story of how I ended up a Cubist.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Hopefully, this coming snowstorm will bring more offer letters,
more jobs for everybody. Here, I'm down with that.
We can hope. Yeah. So actually, Fang and I have been reading The $1 Billion Molecule. It's a book that chronicles the sort of meteoric rise of the drug company Vertex. And that's where you spent the majority of your career thus far. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like starting there and what you did there?
Yeah, so that was my second job. So I was at Cubist for a little under 2 years. And, this is the classic biotech story. Cubist decided to in-license a molecule that became Cubicin. They diverted a lot more of their resources towards the development of Cubicin, which was a smart business decision. But I was a research guy, so as soon as that was announced, I went back to my office, started working on my CV. And my roommate in the company said, hey, there's this new company down the road. It's kind of a hot place where you should think about looking at Vertex. And I'm an enzymologist by training, more of a mechanistic biochemist. And I really wanted to go someplace where I could learn how that was applied in service of making a drug. So I applied at two places. I applied at Merck through a contact there, and I applied at Vertex and interviewed and got the Vertex job. At that point, that was before they had a single drug. It was in Central Square in Cambridge, and it had this real garage band feel to biotech. So some of the buildings, so you go to see the new facility they have, which is absolutely gorgeous. This was not that. These were, I can remember coming in and my desk was in a corner and it was pretty clear they'd had a water leak and there was a little bit of mold growing in the corner. But it was great to get there and get started. And my first job was really going back to being a bench biochemist and being a single contributor. What really drew me to the place, what leaves me with affection to this day to that place, is how scientifically driven it was. The quality of the scientists was first rate. And you walked in and you knew it from the second you were there. It wasn't like, oh, I'm the smartest person here. It's like, oh my God, I've got to make sure I don't fall out of step with everybody else.
Wow.
And then the second part, because this was before Vertex was really commercially successful, it was pretty early in those days.
So how many people were there?
When I joined, it would have been about 120.
Small size.
So still small
middle size.
Yeah. Past its inaugural point, but still, I think it'd been going for about 5 years or so when I joined. It had this intensity about it that just fit my personality. I'm pretty type A. I like working on things. I'm pretty driven. And you went in there every day and it was really about moving the ball scientifically. You were held to a high standard. You were surrounded by people that were like-minded. And so it had an intensity, but it felt like fun. It really did. And so we were at that point working on the first HIV drug was in late stage clinical development, moving towards approval, but a lot of the projects that were going to become the cornerstones for Vertex either hadn't started yet or were just starting. But I loved the vibe. It was what you could do with science, with a group of motivated people and some resource and just kind of a hunger to pull it off. I think the other part, which is a lesson I've taken with me my entire career, is it was not a place where you shied away from problems that people would think would bordered on impossible. You were encouraged to do it.
Oh, wow.
So and I think that's captured in the $1 billion molecule. A funny side story. When I got the job at Vertex, I bought 3 copies of the book, one for myself and sent one to my parents and one to my father-in-law and mother-in-law. And my parents-in-law read it and said, "Oh, good book. Yes, this is exciting. Congratulations." And my mom read it and said, "You're going to go work there? Oh my God. Are you going to be okay?" Because, there's some tough stories in that book. But it was, I fell in love with the process of how drug discovery worked. And I really fell in love with it there. It was just an amazing time. And the company was growing and going. And at least that's when I started. It felt great to be there.
Yeah, I think you described the energy of a company like that very vividly. And I've heard many of the same things said about companies like Genentech, about how science-driven they are, ambitious. I heard you say that biotech is an argument between science, management, and business. Can you tell us a little bit about that and, when exactly the science needs to win and when exactly those other elements might have to win?
Sure. I think that anyone who thinks making a drug or launching a company around a drug or making all the pieces fit together between the business, the medicine, and the science and thinks that's a process or as easy as no one that's ever done it. And I think that in particular in a startup, but even in established companies, there are always common tensions that you have to manage. So, that quote really comes more from my experience when I was in senior management, where you have, let's say you're running a research group, you have an obligation and often a passion to make sure the research moves and that you're doing things, but that will always cost money. So it's at odds with some of the other priorities in the business. And sometimes those are easy discussions, but often it's a bit of a bidding war. You've got, especially when you have a commercial organization, the commercial folks may come back and say, "Hey, look, we can get 4% of the bottom line. That's real cash. This guy's selling fantasy." And so as the head of research, for example, you have to defend the potential of what you can do. And there's the thing that I often mentor people when they're starting their first company or they're taking, they're going to do their startup here at Life Lab or something like that is 2 things. One, make sure the role you take on fits your personality. So, if you're not the person that's going to dream every day about building the business and fundraising, maybe being the CEO isn't for you. Maybe being the chief scientist is a better fit and being the person beside that person. But you have an obligation to become bilingual. You need to understand enough about the business and the language of business that you can have a good conversation with the CEO and the people who are doing the fundraising so that when it's your time to say, "We lose this time." It's the time for the other parts of the business to take the lead, whether that's a financial or a medical lead, wherever it might go. So I think that tension is common to almost everything I've seen in drug discovery. Ideally, you're in a team where you can have these discussions, even if they're forceful, and you just go have a beer and break bread afterwards. That's always it. But I think you do need to push on these issues hard because it's they're in the end, if it's a dollars discussion, there's only so much money to go around. And so it's not like there's this infinite pot. So somebody's going to get to do something. Somebody isn't. You want to be part of that decision and you want to know when to stand your ground on an issue and you want to know when you have to honor the other parts of the business and say it's their turn.
Yeah, you mentioned the Life Lab and, some of the advice that you give to maybe people kind of getting started in the biotech industry. I also want to kind of pick your brain about some of the lessons you learned in senior management When you started at Vertex, it was a relatively small company. When you left, it was a $30 billion
30 billion,
company, and
100 billion.
now
Yeah.
it's over
Yeah.
$100 billion.
It's crazy. Yeah.
So it's a very exciting time to be at Vertex, the time while you were there. And as the company is growing, you're also moving up the ladder, so to speak. I'm just wondering if there are consistencies, certain philosophies that hold true at every stage in the process, and then also the things that maybe you only learned once you had the kind of perspective from the boardroom.
Or learn the hard way because you messed it up when you got there would be probably a more accurate way
Sure.
to put it. I think I do have a couple of things, I'll call them philosophies, that I learned. And I think regardless of where you are on the strata of an organization, they're pretty important. The first one is that if you want people to try really, really hard things, be really careful what you measure as success. So, for example, if what you want to do is take on a very difficult drug discovery problem, the chances are, the probability is that project's going to fail. So one of the things I started doing when I was in more middle management and kept all the way through my management career was to grade the quality of the attempt instead of the outcome. And it sounds fuzzy, but it's not particularly hard. You're both scientists. You know what good science looks like. You know what conservative or bad science looks like. And you have to be obvious and intentional about it. So if you give trophies just to the winners, at least in my experience in the research end, if you're trying to do hard things, what you'll get is less innovation.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be pushing people towards being rewarded for doing things that are more likely to work.
Yeah.
And I think this is it's common practice in some businesses, but in our business, particularly if you're really trying to break open a new area, I don't think it's a good practice. I think that's, I would say that was something that I felt pretty early in my career was the right way to go, that my job as the person running a group was to shield the people in the group so that they could take the attempt. And then, you get to a point when you're in senior management where they just count how many drugs came out, how did the company do financially, et cetera. But honestly, at that point, you're doing pretty well financially, et cetera. And you have to remember a lot of these folks are earlier in their career. So what are you doing to create an environment that allows them to protect themselves in a way that they can still do well, still bring home something for their family, all the practical good stuff. Sure. So I think that's definitely one thing I learned. I think the second thing I learned was there's a book that really influenced me called Quiet, and it's a book about introverts. And I think one thing that can get lost, particularly when we think about startup biotech and kind of the glam and the pitch and all that kind of thing, most scientists are introverts. And we have this tendency, and it's a particular tendency in American business to lionize the loud voice.
Sure.
And I think one of the things I tried to do when I was in a more senior position at Vertex was create spaces where you could harvest the ideas from folks that weren't necessarily the people who were going to win the oratory contest, but they're deep thinkers. And there's all kinds of different things you can do to support it. But the first thing you have to do is visibly do it. And it can be as simple as, we're going to have a topic. You send that topic out a week in advance. So the people who like to dig deep before they say anything have time to really dig into that topic. And you make sure for every single person you invited that you go to every single one of them and say, what hasn't been said? Tell me what you're thinking. And then you have to create an environment when they do express that voice that even if it's not the idea that everyone's going to go with and everything, they're still lauded for the bravery of bringing that idea forward. So I would say third management principle that I certainly learned when I had broader responsibilities. And in fact, this has become a pretty well-worn business principle. Amy Edmondson talks about this over at the business school, for example. Is there really, what do you do to reward good failure? We've talked about that. but how as a leader do you react to bad news? So,
quite different.
you've got
Yeah.
$100 million program. It's just blown up on the pad. The person bringing you that news feels horribly, absolutely horribly. The last thing you should do if you want to have followership and you want to create a truth-telling culture is lose it. That is your problem. You're the person that's in charge. You are inheriting that problem from the person who told you that. And it has to feel that way. It has to be your problem, and you have to relieve them to the degree that you can of the responsibility for it. And that is, again, another way that you can create a conduit that the people in your organization bring you things that are new, bring you things that aren't working well, et cetera. And so as a senior manager, when people are willing to come to tell you that stuff, you've got many more handles that you can begin to drive the business with than if you're kind of terrifying and the person spent the last 6 months on their PowerPoint slides and they hand it to you. Do you really think you really know what's going on? Probably not.
Right.
Probably not. So I think those are the biggest ones I learned and tried to emulate, but learned some of them the hard way by making a bunch of mistakes as I moved up.
Did you personally experience the situation, like bad news?
So both as the deliverer and the recipient. Yeah. So we talked a little
How
about
do you manage that? Yeah. Frustration. I know.
Yeah, sure. I think, look, it's, so there's been a bunch of times where I've had to be the bearer of bad news to senior management, and it's always a bad day. I've had bosses that were great about sort of living into the fact that, the data is the data and you have to live with it. Some that would get a little bit more upset, that was always there. I think probably one thing that it's adjacent to the question you asked, but it was pretty important. I can remember one experience I had when I was pretty early in my Vertex career, but my job was to be a project lead. So I was running a drug discovery project. I was probably 6, 7, 8 years into my career, something like that. And it was not going well. And we had senior management review. So for folks that have been in the pharma industry, you're familiar with this. But for those that haven't, you walk into a room. It's usually a big table. All the powerful people are there. It's a little like your thesis exam on steroids. And your responsibility is to sort of relay what's going on. And I stood up there for quite a while. And at that moment, my job was to be the bearer of bad news and just take the incoming flack. And I did it. And the number of people on the team that came up afterwards and thanked me for just doing it was really encouraged me to think that's a good way that if you're trying to have folks trust you, when you're in charge, when it's bad news, it's your problem and you have to own it. You don't make excuses. You don't scapegoat it. You just own it. That is really hard. So you go home, have a beer, maybe more than one, go run, jog, do something more healthy, kind of blow off steam. As you get more experienced, it's a little easier because you've been through it before. The first few times is terrifying. Just pit in the stomach stuff. But, over time, you get used to it.
Yeah. I'm sure that's something that you never necessarily enjoy, though, even though it's the right thing to do.
No.
And we've all been in situations like that. So you've had this very long and successful career in industry, but you end up deciding to sort of return to the academic side of things. Can you tell us a little bit about that decision and why you're here at Harvard?
Yeah. As I joke all the time, this is my retirement job. So
you are busier, I think.
My children tease me about this is the way you would retire. So it's a little type A, I guess. But I was a reviewer for an external reviewer for the Q-Faster program, which is one of the translational grant programs here at HMS. And I'd been doing that for about 2 years. And so the Q-Faster program is for professors on the quad and folks that they collaborate with. And it's really meant to foster working on something that would be taking basic science and really moving it in a translational direction. And I got introduced to David Golan and Dean Daly through that. And I was really enjoying it. And in fact, I'd had some teaching gigs and other things like that all the way through my industry career. And I always intended that I would retire to teach and go and just go and often teach biochemistry or drug discovery or whatever it might be. And it's a little bit about making sure you kind of understand yourself. I like running a business. I love science. I love being around scientists. It's just, even in senior management positions, 20 minutes at the whiteboard with a young scientist would get me through 2 days of spreadsheets. It was, it's what I wanted. So I always wanted to go back and do something like this. So I was at Alkermes. There was a restructuring at Alkermes about the time I was leaving, or about the time I was there. And I had been asked if I would consider doing this job. And it's kind of a 2-part story. The first part was I was still on the review committee and I was still working at Alkermes. And George Daly talked about the Therapeutics initiative at the event it was like a poster event for Q Faster.
Wow.
And I came home to my wife and I said, geez, I think George Daly just described my dream job. I'd really like to do that. It'd be super cool. You get to do all this high-class science and you're doing all this translation. It'd be great. But I was employed. And then when the restructuring happened, it was a moment to sort of step back and say, what would I like to do next with my career? And, everybody's going to go through those moments. Yeah. So I reached out to George to see if the position was still open. It was, interviewed for it and came. But it was, there were 2 or 3 things that attracted me to it. One, I do get a chance to teach.
Nice.
And I think it's been unbelievably rewarding it feels like you're giving back a little.
Yeah.
And also just, we have such brilliant students here. Oh my goodness. They're so much smarter than I am. It's just great to talk to people like that. And they're just figuring out how something works. And you're like, wow, you did that 10 times faster than I did. That's really impressive. And so that's been great. But also because of the way the Therapeutics Initiative was set up and the initial very generous donation from the Blavatnik Foundation, it was going to be able to be done at a scale that was a little different than some of these more translational initiatives at a lot of other schools. So it also had the opportunity to do some pretty big things in terms of how academic science flows to industry. And if you could change it, if you could start thinking about more efficient ways of doing it. And that was super attractive. Just the idea that you can get in almost at the philosophical level and think about how you could do it better. And, it's, lastly, it's Harvard Medical School, man. The quality of the academic science in our environment is peerless. On 2 scales, there's very, very good institutions that have similar quality investigators, but not as many of them. Our community is big and good. So the number of people that you bump into that have amazing ideas is just incredible. And then beyond that, if you have a question, and your faculty here, the people you can reach out to that are in the neighborhood, there's really, there's some beautiful, wonderful other places in the world that do great stuff, but this place is special. It's really special.
Yeah, I think we already answered our next questions. That's motivation. That's your motivation to establish the translation initiative. Now it's Therapeutics initiative.
Yeah, I think that, George is the person who founded it. So I was recruited to come in and run it. George's motivation, which I share 100%, was what we wanted to do was, you could call it a culture change in a way, but what could we do with the phenomenal basic science that was going on, particularly at the HMS Quad, that would accelerate its pace towards a medicine that could impact human health? Because as a medical school, that is actually in our mission statement. That's what we do. And we have some incredibly accomplished translational scientists here. We have some incredibly accomplished basic scientists here. For the people who are more on the basic side or hadn't thought about doing translational work before, how can we build a conduit that allows them to do their basic work, but also think about the implications of their idea in the broader world. And so that was George's general thesis: is can we begin to be more active in doing that? And it was more from a philosophical direction. It was really like, as a medical school, let's do this because it's kind of the right thing to do. Obviously, if you do it right, there are business implications and all those sorts of things, but that really wasn't the founding direction. It was much more about, we've got such brilliant science that's going on. What can we put into the environment so more of it could impact human health more directly? So that was part of that was a big part of the motivation. I think the second part, my motivation, I'll call it the experiment, for lack of a better way of putting it, is there's an artificial barrier, this is just my opinion, that's put up between science that's in academia and science in industry. There's reasons for the barrier, compliance reasons and traditional reasons and things, but there are brilliant scientists here. There are brilliant scientists in industry. And if you're trying to solve a problem like COVID or something big like that, can we figure out better ways that we harness the power of all of it? And find different ways that we could work together so we are collectively more capable of attacking big, awful, difficult problems? And could we rethink the relationship in a way that would allow you to work a little more seamlessly together, but bring together that kind of intellectual firepower to go after big problems? That's the thing I want to work on. That was why I came, in a way, and I genuinely believe it. I think that's there's just such amazing scientific talent in the broader Boston area in the United States. We can do a better job of maybe conducting the symphony.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, I'm interested in the fact that we frequently talk about translating science into therapeutics or going from academia to industry. But as you said, there's great scientists in industry doing amazing work that maybe academics could benefit from. Of course, some of the technologies that they might be developing are going to be sort of restrained by patents and the proprietary nature of working in industry. Would you say it's safe to say that there's one direction flow from academia to industry in terms of ideas that should go both ways?
Yeah, I would say increasingly it's a two-way street. One of the things that when George brought me here, I was a person from industry. I was appointed as a professor of the practice in the BCMP department. That was part of George's view that we can start fostering more scientific exchange between industry and academia, be able to have people come in, leave. Many luminary academics will go out and take senior positions in biotech and pharma, but from what they've learned, can they bring it back and be part of the academic community? I think that in particular, if you're focused on translation, and in particular, if you're focused on trying to find things that will impact human health, let's kind of think about what we all do really well. The reality is that academic science is still by far the most effective way to break open new biology. And there's really no substitute for it. It's part of what is so heartbreaking about the idea that fundamental science may not get funded or is under threat, because that is where these ideas come from, sort of this unfettered mining into what you can know. I often describe it as when a really big biological discovery comes through, it's a big domino that tips over dominoes that might fall for 30 years. Right? Because it just sets open a whole area that you can go at and then find practical ways to exploit through a drug, et cetera. Industry, in particular in the drug discovery phases, don't need much advice from us. They're really, really good at it. And they really know how to take biology and apply it. So I think one way I've talked about this before in a couple of public fora is maybe what we need to do is take a step back and think about the drug discovery process as an integrated journey from the idea through the drug and its approval. And if you rethought that process that way, and you put it through the window of a patient that's waiting for that medicine, how could you shave a year or two out of that process by thinking about ways you could work more effectively together?
Right.
And so I think there's some conversations I'm involved in now with folks in the pharmaceutical industry. They're kind of going in that direction. It's just being able to really harness the best of what we do well, figure out a way that we can work together, make sure that that way of working together allows us to continue, even expand the way we educate our students, train our postdocs, create publishable research. It's not as at odds as I think is perceived with patentability and things. Early biology, for example, is something you can do together, even with a corporate partner, and have the vast majority of it, if not all of it, be something you share with the world as good scholarly work. Let me give you a practical example of something that the academic community learned the hard way during COVID that the pharmaceutical industry has known for 100 years. We're going to go back to something that I find very painful, reading some of the literature. And this is really the whole field of drug repurposing, which during COVID was an enormous effort, right? And rightfully so. If we could find something that worked, that was already out there and could be distributed quickly, then that was the right thing to do for sure. If you're working in the field of antivirals, and I started my career in infectious disease, one thing that you know is you never inhibit half of the growth of a bug.
Yeah.
So, an MIC for an antibacterial is the minimum concentration of that drug that stops all growth of that bacterium. It's not an IC50, it's IC 99.99 or whatever it would be. And there was established literature with clinical correlates, particularly from the HIV literature, the HCV literature, that if you can't meet or exceed the EC90 or higher for inhibition of viral growth, you're not going to see a good clinical outcome. And everybody in pharma that works in that field knows that. Yet, what did we see in the repurposing literature? Constantly these things that were not nearly going to be effective enough at the concentration you could reach in a human being at the approved dose. Paper after paper after paper, just doing these IC50s or bombing it in a 10 micromolar. And then people will get excited, oh, we're going to try that. And so that's a good example where I think the shared knowledge would be really, really helpful. I think this is how you avoid ivermectin trials. Because these are things that you would look at on just the basic. If I was running a pharmaceutical operation, I would say that thing's just not potent enough to work. We know this. We've done this many times. And I think there's many of those sorts of lessons that can really help both sides. And there's obviously so many things that industry learns from academia as well. But that's an example of something moving in the other direction.
Academia is heavily publication driven. So they publish what they already got. IC50, if it's recyclable, they publish. I think that's a different perspective. IC90, as you mentioned, that's the clinically relevant, but in reality, the scientists need to get a grant. They publish.
It's an established standard. Yeah.
Right.
I guess it goes back to my just general belief that science is science. And that in the end, so any of us that have ever done peer review of a grant or peer review of a paper or something like that, your job is to look at it, make sure it was done well, raise questions that may not have been raised in the initial study. But what's the goal? The goal is to ensure that the science that's being published is of high quality and stands up to a certain standard. So I don't know that that's different depending upon where you live. I think that's what we all sort of shoot for if we're really trying to do high quality science. So I think that more the way I see it is there's lessons everywhere. And being open-minded to those lessons, but also creating conduits where you can hear those lessons more often. One of the things we've done with the Therapeutics initiative is whether it be for the Therapeutics graduate program or the master's program we just launched, we have a lot of speakers from industry.
Mhm.
And so if you're teaching a drug discovery class, you can come in and have folks that did this for a living for a long time and share what they know. And now the students know it. And then eventually this propagates into being something that the community knows. And this is what academia has done for hundreds and hundreds of years. You put out something, you communicate it in the public space, that idea gets batted around. And eventually more people know about it. So it becomes the standard to which the science gets held. So I think it's just more about opening up the conduits in both directions as you started the question. And none of these things are proprietary or anything. It's just understanding how these systems work.
Yeah, definitely one of the missions of the Harvard Biotech Club is to bridge the gap and open the conduits, as you've said.
Yep.
And it's definitely important to keep in mind that it needs to go both ways. One of the easiest, most straightforward ways to open those conduits, to bridge that gap, is just to have people of different backgrounds working on different things in close proximity. And, we're here in the Life Lab. Fang and I have had a chance to see firsthand the exciting science that's being done here. It's an absolutely beautiful space that we're lucky to have access to. Can you tell us a little bit about the model of
Sure.
the Life Lab and its intended purpose?
Yeah, and
Yep.
we are lucky. I mean, the generous gift that set this up, had an incredible impact on our community. So the model of the Life Lab is this is an extension of teaching.
Mm.
And an extension of the basic philosophy that we talked about, which is how can we make it easy for more of our academic, our PIs, for example, our academic community, to take their idea out the door and think about how it could become a medicine. So the model is that we have actually 2 biotech incubators at Harvard. There's the one that's run over on the Alston campus by the business school. And the one that's run here, the Blavatnik Harvard Life Lab Longwood. The first and one of the better decisions I ever made was to reach out to the people running the Life Lab in Alston and ask them how it was going and how they did it. And here, my colleague Amitabh Chandra, who's the academic director over there, the other people that were running it, that entire group couldn't have been more generous in helping us set this up. So we might still be setting it up if they hadn't helped. And what grew out of that is we've got a single admissions committee for both Life Labs. So rather than competing for new companies or ideas that are coming up, the one over here on the Longwood campus focuses more on therapeutics. The one in Alston has a larger life science remit, but there are therapeutics companies over there. And as a company comes to apply, they can choose where they go. That is up to them. But part of what we're trying to build around that is I advise on some of the science of therapeutics, regardless of whether the company's here or in Alston.
Yep.
And we have such wonderful colleagues and contacts on the business side that, again, are of great use, regardless of whether the company is here or in Alston. The companies that we target for admission meet 3 criteria. The first criteria is some sort of a Harvard affiliation. So that Harvard affiliation can be through any of the Harvard schools. So to get in here, it doesn't have to be an HMS affiliation. Could be the business school, et cetera. All of the affiliated hospitals, if you're Harvard faculty at the affiliated hospital, this is meant for you. It's not meant to be just within sort of the more typical, I'll call it the business unit of Harvard. And we grade the strength of the affiliation. So if you're a quad A faculty member, PI, that gets an A. And then if you postdoc here for a year, 12 years ago, that's probably not an A, kind of. So that's one part. The second part is we have an excellent review committee filled with prestigious folks from the venture community, science, et cetera, that vet the idea the same way that you would for starting any business with both an eye towards the business piece, but I think really digging into the science and making sure that there's an idea there that we think has got some legs and it's credible. And then the third part of it is we want companies that are come in and be good members of the community. So if you're in an incubator, rather than going to get your own space, it's shared space, but it's a little bit more than that. You're expected to help your neighbor out.
Yeah.
Can you give me a hint on how to fundraise? I heard this was going on, and rather than, standing in a corner and shielding your data and things, I think you have an expectation that you're going to participate. So that's the folks that we admit. We focus on relatively early companies in the seed to pre-seed area. So if you can go out and get a multi-tens of millions of dollars Series A, we don't feel like we can help you all that much.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got numerous options. The other place where we place an emphasis, and I think where we've done our best work, for lack of a better way of putting it, is inaugural founders. And so we can surround you with an infrastructure. So, for example, both Life Labs are run by Lab Central.
Mm-hmm.
So the administration of the Life Labs is professional, top rate, all the stuff works properly, et cetera. And for the Life Lab here in the Longwood, I think it's a terrific place that if you have wet work bench science to do, the open lab space is, pretty typical of what you'd get of any of these startup incubators, but you're plunked in the middle of the Harvard Medical School campus with all of the core facilities around you.
Yeah.
And all the other pieces which you can access as a corporate partner.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like to think of this as a place where if you've got a year or two of bench science, and in particular if you're a faculty member at one of the affiliated hospitals or here on the Quad, it's a really good place to get that work done. So lastly, going back to the philosophical part, we want to make it easy that if we've got a first-time founder, particularly a faculty member or a postdoc or someone like that, that you can give your idea a try. So sometimes when you're looking for funding, particularly in the venture community, you're going to have to let go of that idea. I mean, you always have to let go of it at a certain point. If you want to hold on to it a little while, we want to be a place where you can do that, but we also want to surround you with advice where that idea still moves forward and the business aspects of it maybe don't get impaired. And then you can also figure out what role you want to play in all of this. So something I'm particularly passionate about is in the entrepreneurship community, we have this tendency to try and say, well, everybody's got to be an entrepreneur, but I actually don't fundamentally think that's true. I think you have to follow who you are and what your passions are. So if you're just dying to start a business and you got the thing, you got the it, and you're going to be that person, I will hook you up with the best people to mentor you, and you're going to be great at it. The part I've been focusing on is what makes you a good scientific co-pilot to that person. Understanding enough of the business, understanding how science works in a startup and the things that are critical and not, and realizing you are an important part of the business and how you can be a good partner.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we train that a lot. So I think that's the other that's not for, you asked about the model. I guess that's the model is really give a space where people can try out their new idea, do it close to home if they're a faculty member here.
Yeah, close to home.
And do it in a way where, we're really trying to help you figure out not just the idea, but what role you want to play in
It's
it.
experimenting, as you mentioned, right? It's also not a bench experimenting, also like a business, whatever, entrepreneurial experimenting.
It's the fight, right?
Yeah.
The science and the business are going to fight, and you got to fundraise, and you want to do $1 million of experiments. You got $100,000. Well, okay, which 1/10 of what are we doing today? So,
so as a follow-up question, so you just mentioned first time entrepreneur, and it's less likely for established PI to operate a company. There are students and postdoc, they going to join a company like an early employee, even become interim CEO to run a company. What's your opinion?
Boy, it's a big question. I guess it's just a couple of bits of advice that are pretty basic. It is hard. And I think as scientists, occasionally we have this idea that business is pretty easy because science is so hard. Business is really hard. And so go into it with a little bit of reverence for the art and surround yourself. If you really are a grad student or a postdoc and you're going to try and take the boat out on your own, we've got an amazing mentoring community in the entrepreneurship space in Boston. This is the best place I can imagine that you can find someone that's going to show you the ropes. Find that person. Don't feel like you've got to kind of go do it out on your own. I think the Biotech Club does a really good job of being a conduit for these sorts of things. But in the broader sense, talk to me, talk to Amitabh, talk to other people that are involved in the ecosystem. We've got so many people who have been successful that would love to give back. And so I think that that's the first bit of advice. And, because the brutal, honest part is doing this for the first time with no help is near impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to
Agree.
make sure you understand it, and you just don't know what pits in the road you're walking into.
Yeah.
I think the second thing I would say is no matter how good your pitch is, if the science isn't good, it's not going anywhere. So don't think you can wind your way into something by being clever with the business model if you don't, in your soul, believe you're advancing what you want to do scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
I would say this is one of the places where it's hard to judge companies these days when they're in the AI space.
Mm-hmm.
Because I see companies all the time who claim they've cracked the code and they're going to have a drug in 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And the algorithm is, we can't tell you about it. It's sort of behind the wall, et cetera. I don't think we're there yet today. And at a certain point, those sorts of things will become obvious. And you're going to dedicate a good chunk of your young life to this.
Mm-hmm.
So is this really worth 3 years of your life? Is this what you want to do? Because it's going to be a lot. And if you don't believe in the idea, like really believe in it, I might give it a pass. So I think that's the two biggest things is don't go it alone. You don't have to. And, really start with the scientific foundation for a biotech, for example, the space I work in, start with the scientific foundation and be really convinced there's something there. Really, really convinced.
Good suggestion. Yeah.
Yeah, those are definitely big questions and important things to keep in mind. And I think one of the beauties of being in Boston, what largely entails the magic of this place that you spoke of earlier in our conversation, is the fact that there's just such a density of mentors, of people that have been through it, of people that you can go through it with. So I think that's definitely important to take advantage of and to think about almost as much as you're thinking about the science. A lot of us academics every day, maybe every hour of every day almost, you're thinking about the science, but when you step into that whole other world, the other side of things, there's a lot of other things to consider.
And I'll say that there's also sort of I'll almost call it a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you've been successful enough in your scientific career that you're studying with us, you're very good at what you do. And learning I'll call it the humility. I don't know if I mean it quite that way, but understanding that you just don't know and you're going to ask can be kind of difficult because you've been rolling through and you're doing really well and you got it figured out. And that kind of being able to step back and say, yeah, I don't think I want to try this on my own can be pretty difficult for some folks, but it's a good learned response. It can be really helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I know Fang has as well. And we just want to sort of wrap up by asking you if you could rewind the clock and go back to your graduate school days.
Oh boy.
Time
is there
travel.
anything that it's time travel a little bit. Is there anything that you would change?
Yeah.
Could be in your career or otherwise.
Yeah, I would have probably cut the mullet off 5 years earlier. I'd start there.
That's a good answer.
I think that I was really lucky. I was really, really lucky. I stumbled into some great things in terms of great mentors and great opportunities. I mean, I think that the thing I would probably go back and change about myself is to a little younger in my career realize it's not really about me. And that you can get in your own way, in particular if you're ambitious and driven. And I can remember one of the harsher mentoring moments I ever had early in my cubist career was somebody who I liked well, who took me into a closed room and bawled me out for basically being arrogant and loud. And I look back and I go, yeah, I was. I regret that. I regret that. So I think just, the understanding that we're all trying to get people to notice us and
Yep.
try to be successful, and understanding the consequences sometimes of overdoing it. So I think that would be the biggest thing I would go back and tell my old self to knock it off, that and the mullet. Yeah.
Do you have any actionable suggestion for graduate students post, the downturn in the market right now?
Sure.
It's really difficult to find a job.
Yeah.
So what's your suggestion?
I don't know if I've got any magic one, but I'll tell you what I've been telling a lot of the graduate students lately. And I think we need to start out by acknowledging this is a turbulent and weird time to be a scientist, to be in biotech, the whole 9 yards. I think that sometimes, especially when you're at that point where maybe you're going to go get your first job or something like that, you're trying to come up with your 10-year plan. I think, especially these days, come up with your 2-year plan.
Mm-hmm.
And then think about what your 10-year plan or 5-year plan might be, because the environment around us is changing so dynamically.
Mm-hmm.
And what skills are going to be employable or not are being rewritten by what AI does on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
So what you think might be the good idea, you might need to adapt to. I think that's one. And again, given the turbulent times that we're in, I think that's more important than ever, is to really just kind of adapt and get through for the time being. The second bit of advice I would give is what employers are looking for when you interview.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get your first job based on your fit because you have a skill that they need.
Yeah.
It could be a lab skill, it could be something else. But what they really want is to believe that you're going to be a joy to be around, and that you're going to grow into something bigger,
Mm-hmm.
that there's potential there. And I think sometimes we forget that the getting your first job or your first step in your career is just basically doing a lot of what you're doing now. And I think in particular, I see these days where we all sort of want to move on so quick. Take a beat.
Mm-hmm.
Make sure that, you've got a sense of, get good at what that thing was, that first thing was. And then think about what the next thing would be. And in terms of job search and things these days, it's just going to take some patience and keep grinding. It is not an easy time. I think biotech has been through these times before, so I do not think this is permanent.
Okay.
I really don't. I think this is why, but is it a tough time now? Yeah, it is. I don't think there's any point in not stating it. I think it's more that what we ultimately do in the biopharmaceutical industry is something people value.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a medicine that can make a family member better, make yourself better, that is something society values. And so I think our ultimate goal, like why we're here, is not gonna change.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel good and confident, particularly that empirical science, and particularly that science and exploration for medicines, is still going to be here in 20 or 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it looks tough at the moment, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't think this is a permanent thing. I really don't.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I'm inspired by the community of scientists as people are tasked with facing some of society's biggest problems, tasked with discovering things that, as you said, no one has ever known before. I think in that context that the industry will face some headwind, but I'm encouraged by the community, and I feel certain that these are people who can face big problems head on, and especially with some words of wisdom from people like you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we're really, really lucky to have you join us, and we appreciate the
absolute pleasure. Thank you for
advice.
having me.
Yeah. This is the end of this episode for the Harvard Griffin Jesus Biotech Club, the Pulse podcast. I'd like to thank Tanner Baldwin for co-hosting this episode. Subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Substack. For more resources, please head over to our website, www.thepulsepodcast.org. Please stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you for listening.